And I see some new faces. I'd like to recognize real quick one of Tennessee Hardwood's board members, Rick Foster, who's sitting in, and he's our botanist.
Unmute yourself. You got muted.
Sorry, I'm learning this muting thing. Sorry. So anyway, hi there. I'm Davis Mounger, and I'm so happy to hear that all these wonderful voices and see some new faces. I don't have time to recognize everybody, but I would like to at least mention we have with us tonight one of our Tennessee Hardwood board members and botanist, Rick Foster, and friends who have given us a lot of feedback on this presentation. John Wallace, David Nickel, got some feedback from David Govis. I'm happy to see some people from out west with Sierra, like Marion Klaus. Thank you from attending virtually from so far away, and many more. And so, like I said, I don't want to make it too rigid to where everyone has to wait till the end. If you have a question like clarifying what something means or whatever, just feel free to do so, and send it in the text box. It's not a problem. I'd rather clarify something than going way down the road on it. So what I wanted to do was to do this presentation because there are a lot of issues with federal lands, and we're going to be speaking mostly about national forests, not exclusively, but mostly, that are problems that we'll see nationwide, whether they're in the legal sphere or even the ecological sphere. But there is really some distinct differences between issues that happen out west and issues that happen in the east. And that makes sense because the history is significantly different, the ecology is significantly different, the land base is significantly different. And so we have a tendency, and rightfully so, to put a lot of focus on Western lands because they make up so much of the land base of this country. But I think it's good to really try to tease out some key differences between some of the way a lot of the drama of national forest management and mismanagement play out across the country, and the ramifications for what happens in the East, but and also how this may have some effects nationwide as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get going on our presentation here, and I'm not the world's biggest presentation.
Did everybody introduce themselves?
We're moving along, and this is Cheryl Campbell. She's my co-director. And she helped found Tennessee Hardwood 12 years ago, 12 and a half, something like that years ago. And she helps make the engine run. So let's go ahead and get going here. We've titled this informally with a little mnemonic, 3 R's: restoration, resiliency, and regeneration follies in the central hardwood region. And this is a work of Tennessee Hardwood, and we're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization dedicated to the protection, preservation of our public lands. And towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about how you can stay in touch with us and get involved if you wish, give us support if you wish, or attend our awesome events. So what I wanted to do first was before we kick into this, I thought we need to talk a little bit about why the issues in the East might be a little bit different than maybe some other places. So the forests in the East are the product of much earlier settlement than out West. And so many of these lands that are now our national forests or other federal state lands, it had been fully cleared by the 1700s, 1800s, and the final timber railroad mining company, big long haul in the early 20th century. So we have almost no virgin forest left. And we also have a very limited conception of what these forests were like. And there's a lot of reconstructive history and archaeology going on. And as we'll see, that's kind of a lot of where the fight is for the soul of national forests in our region. A lot of the land was cut early as 20th century and was reclaimed farms, mining lands, timber country lands. And so what we have is a lot of the land base of our public lands are about 75, 80 to 100 years old. So they've come up, they've built a canopy, they're kind of dense, they're generally even aged, and we're hoping that they will get left alone so they can develop into a very diverse character that we associate with old growth forest, and takes on that high biodiversity character that forests have when they're allowed to be left alone, develop naturally. Right now we're in that stem exclusion phase. And so land managers think this is an utter disaster and something must be done quick. And so that's part of the problem, is we're not letting time be a manager and start getting where these forests naturally open up and naturally diversify, which we have seen is going to happen if we will give it the chance. So how is the Forest Service going about dealing with the condition of the land and forests in the East? It's with what I call the 3 R's: resiliency, restoration, and regeneration. And these terms are being used in forest management all over the country. So we're going to look at how it's applied in the East. Are there some uses of these terms and ideas that are sincere and meant to promote biodiversity and forest health? There probably are in some places, but for the large part, we are looking at a post-Healthy Forest Restoration Act environment where nowadays, same old symbols, same old logging program for, can't be just to bring in timber revenues. It has to have some sort of ecological justification. So here comes some ecological language to fit the bill, and some would say that this is greenwashing. So you see in vast percent of all timber sales in the East that we've got to regenerate oaks. Okay, oaks are disappearing fast, and we got to do something about it. And there are some forests like the Cherokee and the Boone that have this almost monomaniacal obsession with oak regeneration to the exclusion of about everything else, except maybe shortleaf pine, because that's a big timber tree. So they claim oak had been in decline. And so we have this thing called the fire oak hypothesis, which is that because of fire suppression, that oaks are declining, and we've got to use these management tools to bring them back. Now, on the other hand, foresters have been trying a lot of regeneration tools for decades, and there's a lot of failure going on. And the reasons for this are complex and not fully understood. Lots of things have happened in the last 100 years. Weather patterns have shifted. A lot of previous timber management fads. Yes, there's probably some fire suppression issues. We're not arguing that point. But there's a lot of other factors that are causing the forest composition that we have now. And unfortunately, a lot of these forest regeneration and restoration efforts are actually making the problem worse. So some of the reasons why forests are becoming more or less rich in these oh so desired oaks are out of the control of forest management. A lot of people don't realize is that the South, a lot of the East, particularly the South, was on the whole cooler and wetter in much of the 20th century than in the 18th and 19th centuries, which is when these lands were getting settled and cleared, which were creating, at least at first, a windfall for oaks. Also, very rarely mentioned, you see in a lot of these discussions, well, more nowadays, is the fact is that chestnut pretty much disappeared. It was anywhere from 5, 10, 15% of the composition of forest in a lot of the East. And when they left, a lot of species like maples and poplars filled that gap. So it's hardly surprising they have advanced, because there's something in the forest community that disappeared, much like the hemlock is disappearing in a lot of places. Also, and I think this has been very under-remarked, we've been looking a lot into like, how were forests managed, maybe not in the 1990s, but say in the early days of the Forest Service, like the 1940s and the 1950s. There are some surprising management guides that were out in those decades that may have had an effect in skewing the forests that they are now. There was a period in the Forest Service and in a lot of timber management that back in the 40s and 50s that said we need to get rid of some oaks, we need to get rid of cherry, we need to get rid of certain types of hickories or post oaks in the Southern Appalachians. And while we would never say that post oaks or hickories were like 50% of the canopy, they really seem to be less present than very early forest records showed a century ago. So there is a possibility, we're not trying to definitively claim this, that some management trends may have skewed some of our native species actually down. And what's hilarious is one of the species that in the Southern Appalachians and in the adjacent areas that the Forest Service is trying to get rid of is white pine, when in the 40s and 50s, there were foresters in the agency actually explicitly promoting these species. So every profession has fads, and the Forest Service is no exception. So when we get into forest regeneration or restoration, an underappreciated factor on the land is that we have to blast roads to get that timber out. And that is something that becomes a real problem, especially considering that the agency 20 years ago came up with a thing called the roads rule nationwide, which acknowledged that it had a tremendous backlog of roads that were totally unnecessary and ecologically destructive, causing erosion, the spread of invasive species, siltation of streams. And unfortunately, this rule has not really been promulgated in good faith. And we continue to have timber sales that could be called regeneration or restoration sales that continue to make these so-called temporary roads that are never temporary and persist on the landscape. There are many forests like the Cherokee that are just being overrun with Japanese stilt grass due to keeping these high road volumes. In National Forests in Mississippi and Alabama, these roads become vector points for kudzu. It's just a really bad thing that all these unnecessary road volumes, and we're not talking about main service artery roads. We're talking about what they call these ghost roads of very questionable legality that the agency just sort of keeps on their inventory. And so what happens is in a lot of these forest regeneration and restoration projects that we are finding in the Chattahoochee, in the Pisgah, in the Cherokee, in the Boone, in the Nantahala, that we start seeing the overall biodiversity of these recovering second growth forests that did have a good healthy component of various oaks, sometimes cherries, sometimes various hickory, a walnut family species, skewing into the maples and poplars that the agency says they trying to suppress from taking over. And we're about to see many examples where this happens. And the agency has had decades to try out all kinds of treatments. Let's burn the site before. Let's burn the site after. Let's spray herbicides over the landscape and suppress those maples. Let's hand plant oak seedlings. And unfortunately, as you'll see this picture like in the Chattahoochee, you will see all of the above used, and what comes up is another poplar maple thicket. Regeneration cuts tend to be clear cuts or near clear cuts called shelter wood or seed tree cuts. This can be found throughout, really all over the United States in forest management, but certainly in the East, all the way up into Maine and New Hampshire, like in the White Mountain National Forest. Clear cutting is still the norm in a lot of places. And we really start getting a fragmented landscape. And of course, the agency will say, well, these forests will grow back. That is true in the sense that there's some vegetation that will grow back, but at a general overall reduction of land productivity, soil and water quality, and diversity, not only of trees, but of forbs and the adjacent accompanying animal wildlife. The Shawnee National Forest has been dealing with this for decades, and John Wallace sent us some examples. John's been a activist for decades, along with our good friend Sam Stearns and many other people, and so they've seen forests. Timber projects from all the way back in the 80s and 90s that said, oh, we're going to do oak regeneration. We're going to restore oaks. We need to bring back oaks. We're going to do all this stuff. And so some of these projects have had 30 years, 35, 40 years. So we can't be biased and say, oh, that was only cut a year ago. You're not giving it time. It's the maple, the maple, poplar, beech, sweet gum, complex of more wetter, shadier mesic species that the agency does not like comes out being the winner. Here's a project in the Shawnee that was supposed to regenerate hardwoods back in 1999, and it just regenerated into pines. There's a recent timber sale that was shelterwood sale. So you can see examples where they've left a few leaf trees per acre. That's a shelterwood cut. And they've cut it, they burned it, and look what's coming in, that Japanese stilt grass. And it is all but impossible to get rid of. And so the regenerating whatever the age used to be in the forest, or the agency said used to be there, is our first of our 3 R's. Now comes the fuzzy term, the fuzzy feel-good term, restoration. We all want to restore and heal the landscape, don't we? Doesn't everybody want to do that? I know you do, and I do. But let's take a look at how forest restoration plays out in eastern forests. So this buzzword has been increasingly a part of the lexicon of the agency since the 90s. And of course, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act codified it into law. And so you simply are not going to find a timber sale that isn't some form of a restoration sale, as at least part of its agenda. And by putting in that restoration language, it triggers a lot of agency actions that would not be possible if they did not say this is for the benefit of forest restoration, which is why nothing is just a pure timber, commercial timber sale anymore. So let's see, what does the agency mean when they say legally forest restoration? Well, and go to federal regulations, is a process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And restoration focuses on reestablishing the composition, structure, pattern, processes necessary to facilitate terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem sustainability, resilience, that's our 3rd R that we'll be getting into today, and health under current and future conditions. So sounds wonderful. Let's see how it plays out on the ground. So in the East, a lot of forests are trying to restore, so they say, these very open woodland and savanna habitats that you would associate more like, say, with Oklahoma or East Texas. And that seems to be the huge priority because it dovetails with logging and promoting oaks. Were some of these habitats around the East? Sure. Are there a lot of places they're trying to restore it where it's a total disaster? Absolutely. There are many factors that contribute to these open habitats that, once again, are out of the agency's control. Things like soil type, slope aspect, and another underrated factor is not just fire, but the fact that we used to have a lot of buffalo and elk running around in the East, just like the West, shaping those habitats, and they're not there anymore. The final sense on the slide, we do want to really make a claim on. There is potential for good restoration, but it is simply not possible until it gets separated with timber targets. It just is not going to happen until we can separate the raw logging volume potential for dollars with restoration. We're not saying that never again will any tree ever be cut on public lands necessarily, but until we can look at restoration in an unbiased light, it's just not going to happen. So a lot of the agency in the budgets in the Forest Service, East and West, is fire. The problem is that the way fire is budgeted in the agency, and this is pretty much across the country, are by pure burn block acres. And let's face it, this is like Tennessee is not New Mexico. We don't have 500,000 acres that would burn contiguously every 8 to 12 years and form these grasslands and savannas. And fire would spread in often very targeted spots that, would create something of a mosaic. The idea of tens and thousands of continuous burn blocks naturally burning all, very frequently is probably pretty unlikely in a lot of the East. We do make some exceptions like for coastal environments and things like that, but there simply is not the compelling evidence saying that Southern Illinois burned all the time. So what has happened often, and rangers will pretty much acknowledge this. Fire in some cases winds up becoming a proxy, like herbicides becomes a proxy for what was really a very complicated set of interacting factors that shape forests, which including storms, buffalo, elk, tornadoes, insect damage that would cause tree mortality and help shape that forest development. And the problem is you can't just use fire or just use herbicides to mimic those very complicated interacting factors that took centuries to shape a forest. So the fire oak hypothesis, as I mentioned, has gained a lot of weight in lands management in the East. And so it was popularized in the 1990s. I mean, it's been around since before that, but it really took off then. And according to the the hypothesis, tree ring data and historical records point to upland forests that were more open and received frequent fires from wildfires in Native American land use, which a friend of mine is an archaeologist called the happy hunting grounds theory, that Native Americans would just burn off thousands and thousands of acres all the time for optimum hunting habitat. And so we need to log to prevent oak decline and with burning and herbicides, and we'll just disappear these habitats. And some habitats do have fire association. We're not arguing that hot fire does not belong anywhere in forests. We're not saying that. but it has been used sometimes, not in all districts, but some fairly indiscriminately because they have to. It's not that necessarily the rangers want it that way. They're told you need to burn some big old blocks. And once again, it's tied ultimately to logging most of the time. And in our region, it pretty much skews to focusing on regenerating and promoting a few species of oaks and a couple of species of pine. Like where I live, it's white oak, northern red oak, southern shortleaf pine, and pitch pine. And every once in a while they'll try a Table Mountain pine restoration project. So there's all these other trees and shrubs and habitats that really don't get the attention they deserve. So far out west, as we know, has a very strong ecological roads. By the way, you will see a variety of photographs of a growing boy. That's my son, who's actually on this call. She's about 17 at that point. So like if you go to that patchy seat greaves or the Gila, it's pretty obvious fire has a very strong presence. No argument there. And wildfires carry very easily there. They've tried suppressing fire back in the early 20th century, but even then it was hard because it just burns easy out there. So when I hear a ranger tell me that a fire, like an area in the Cherokee that's not even like a ridge top, needs to burn every 5 years, that's compared to New Mexico. I mean, I just don't see it, but maybe I'm wrong. Some places in the East have a fair amount of fire association, like Table Mountain pine communities, bare rocks, very windy, very dry. The Eastern Black Belt Prairie and the Tombigbee and the Bienville National Forests probably have some strong fire association, but also the fact that they have very alkaline soils. Once again, it's always complex. Linville Gorge has very extreme slope aspect, hydrology that creates strong fire events. Longleaf pitcher plant communities down in the DeSoto in Mississippi are an example of habitats are quite dry due to poor sandy soils, strong fire association. Blackjack oak, my favorite tree that nobody cares about. Probably has some fire association, but it's not commercially very valuable. Nobody cares about restoring that. But many forest districts in the East are experiencing repeated failures of fire-adapted forest community restoration, particularly upland oak sites. Pisgah, Chattahoochee, Cherokee, Boone, Annahala, some of the national forests in Alabama. And you see over and over again these places that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they logged it, they burned it, they sometimes herbicided, they sometimes hand planted it. We're going to get shortleaf pine or pine oak or white oaks. And you see this, just very dense poplars or maples. And so what happens is because the budget is to promote these upland, xeric, dry, fire-associated oak communities, when you only have as a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like this picture here is of a stand of a timber sale that they said, the agency said, was a dry, xeric pine oak site. And you see the maples and the beeches. This is literally down in a draw. And so eventually they kind of said, yeah, we'll drop that one. At least they dropped it. Sometimes we have very reasonable conversations. Okay. Another timber sale that fortunately got stopped in the Cherokee. This was a 50 to 60 degrees shady slope north facing of hemlock and beeches that they were going to log all the way down to a trout stream for dry shortleaf pine restoration. So once again, when you're only given a few tools, and those few tools are like hammers, everything starts looking like a nail. Okay. Common arguments for frequent fire. Native Americans supposedly burn the woods all the time for better hunting, so that's natural, even though there's no evidence of long-term Native American settlement in upper mountains, like in the Appalachians. they tended to congregate naturally, sensibly in rich bottomlands where there's plenty of water, plenty of wildlife, and natural transportation of rivers. So why you would trek up a mountainside and burn it off so you can hunt where there's not a lot of deer to begin with and have to truck that deer back down the mountain, I don't know. I grew up hunting, so I never could quite understand that one. Settlers burned, suppressing fire has, caused this encroachment of mesics. And mesics are like our wet, shady species. They're bad: maples, white pine, poplar. And so fire will promote oaks and open habitat and rare species. And yes, fire does have a role there. We're not saying that. But a lot of these projects have trouble working. And I've kind of already talked this slide. I'm going to skip that. So let's get more cute pictures, okay? So our forests historically in the East were shaped by many factors, not just fire. And of course, the indigenous Native American helicopters and spray guns spraying out herbicides like Garland 4. Ice storms to tornadoes, yes, fire, insect infestations, floods, wind throws, elk, buffalo, beaver, the North America's greatest habitat creator, natural tree senescence, drought, pathogens. But you know what? If we will give time, these guys on this list will do their job, and we will see a lot of healthy forests developing like nature intended. And so, as we've been mentioning, this restoration of these dry upland oak and pine oak sites are popular because, leaf pine and oaks, those are mostly the most commercially valuable trees, and they're theorized to be in decline. And so we got to do something to get more of them. So let's log oaks, create more oaks, or restore oaks and things like that. So and once again, it's tied to the fire budget. So let's take a look at some of these restoration failures. Let's get into some of we've looked at regeneration failures. Let's look at places where the agency has said, okay, this area is in ecological decline and we need to log and do whatever we need to do to bring back an oak or a pine oak habitat, because those are only two habitats that are of any interest in many of these districts. So Chattahoochee has been trying shortleaf pine and oak restoration for years, with many projects going back to the 80s, 90s that have just simply not worked. Here's one up the Armuchee Ridges. I actually had a ranger there tip me off, and when I call him on the phone, and I call him point blank. I said, "So how's your shortleaf restoration going?" And you can tell this guy was about to retire. In fact, I think he says nobody knows how to restore shortleaf. And he said, "You want to know what a joke shortleaf restoration is in this region?" And he gave me the coordinates. He said, "Go out to this place on Armuchee Ridges, and this is what shortleaf restoration looks like. There it is. How do you like it?" So whoever that ranger was, it will remain nameless. Thanks for tipping me off about that. I appreciate when somebody's being upfront, twilight of their career, and they're just like, you know what? We need to try something else. Then we come to the Brawley Project, which David Govis, who's on this call, has fought for so long. And this was an oak woodland creation attempt. And this brought in another new trend in public lands management called stewardship contracting. And this is where the agency is trying to do these public, private, or public, nonprofit, private partnerships of administering timber sales to supposedly reduce red tape and agency budget shortfalls, and they'll just outsource the administration of a timber sale. And one organization, and I'm not picking on them specifically, it's just one that we're familiar with around here, the National Wild Turkey Federation, got this stewardship contract. And so here we go. So around like a decade ago, they're going to create a pine savanna. And this is what happened. Yeah. And so it's just death. And And, you know, what happens is that they, you know, sure, they are going to go and maybe take a look at some of these areas that they screwed up decades ago, the agency screwed up decades ago and turned into poplars and maples. But sometimes healthy older stands will get logged. And they'll herbicide, reduce the coppice sprouting, so it'll poison the landscape. And another one of these tangentials, this is also going to restore the golden wing warbler, which is the Southern Appalachians logging bird. Like the Bachman sparrow is the logging bird in the pine belt in the South, because it supposedly needs that early cirral open habitat. So we need to log this out. They'll bring the golden wing warblers. No success. And so the Southern Environmental Law Center eventually did a Freedom of Information Act and found that this was a cluster, you know what, in the contracting. They tried herbicides and sprayed, and this still keeps coming up. A lot of eroded skid roads resulted in these logging areas. And as I think it was David had told me this, the Wild Turkey Federation steward just couldn't seem to get out there enough to make sure that these loggers were like staying within the bounds. And so locals would come out and say that these guys are running skidders all the way down the stream and logging outside the bounds. And someone go get the forest steward contractor to come from wherever and flag this. And so it was something. The Cherokee, which is where we spend a lot of our time in Tennessee Hardwood, has done a lot of pine and oak restoration attempts. And this is codified in its management plan, as it is in most management plans in our region. And unfortunately, a lot of the soils in the Cherokee are listed by the USGS survey as having severe ratings for erosion and compaction. And so timber sales wind up looking like this sometimes. They logged out an 89-year-old stand to supposedly promote shortleaf pine restoration. We're going to bring shortleaf pine. And this is what happened. Not only did the pines not come, the entire hillside eroded off down to the bare ground. And the agency had to spend, after we kind of brought it to public light, spent $100,000 bringing in turf to mitigate one single stand of taxpayer money. All the rest of the stands remain unmitigated, and some kind of look like this. So we looked further after this timber sale called the hogback sale. So we did a Freedom of Information Act. And because fortunately the new ranger who did not cause that sale said, yeah, maybe we kind of need to make sure we don't do something like that. He's a good guy. I like him a lot. And so he did some research. He had them go out and take a look at past logging and see kind of what's happened. And so they disclosed some of it, but unfortunately they didn't disclose all the results of their study. So we did a Freedom of Information Act, which still got heavily censored, but we were able to find out what stands they looked at and kind of what they saw. And you can see that some of the stands were pretty messed up. And we actually wound up inventorying several of the worst. There's plenty more than this that are pretty bad, but ones that actually were acknowledged by the agency as violating Forest Service policies on causing bare ground, persisting persistent erosion, and none of them successfully regenerated oaks or shortleaf pines. Not a single one of these sites did. And so this remains a problem. We wind up getting Virginia pine, which is a pine they don't want, and lots of poplars and lots of maples, and lots of eroded bare ground that contributes to the overall lowering the productivity of the land. And unfortunately, the agency, even though it did here in the Cherokee acknowledge some of the problems, they have still kept censored from us hundreds of pages of their research of their analyzing the results of these past timber sales for obvious reasons. It does not look flattering to these agency agendas of restoration. And we've even appealed this, and I think we've still got 300 pages of our original requests that are still censored after an appeal of the actual FOIA. So there's a lot that they obviously found that they had to admit they didn't like, but they not so sure the public needs to know it. The land between the lakes, and this deserves its own presentation. I wish we had time for it. Our friend David Nickel, Land Between the Lakes Local, has valiantly worked on protecting LBL for years. This is a classic case of failed misguided restoration. So 8,600 acres of the land between the lakes have been devoted to creating an oak woodland, and it's been pretty much a disaster. Tangles, blackberries, no forbs, no grasslands, no savanna characteristics, and it just looks pretty bad. And so this is supposed to be an oak grassland creation, and they've been on this for I think 12, 13 years. I hadn't seen a blade of grass or any other real forb in many of these stands ever, and there's 8,600 acres of this. There's really just no significant successes at all. And the LBL is very unusual in a lot of rural forest districts in that its locals really do care about preserving the land and not seeing it misused. I can't tell you, because I've worked on so many forest districts where just nobody seemed to really care that much. And they have had protests, public meetings. They managed to get Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul to force a moratorium for 4 years from logging on the land between the lakes. That is not something that happens every day. So we are very proud of the people who live over the land between the lakes in Kentucky and Tennessee. This has just been an exemplar of how local action can bring real reform in the East. And this was the first time I've ever heard of a large protest against an ecological theory that the LBL is supposed to be an oak woodland grassland. Very interesting, and shows a real sophistication on the part of the local public that I find admirable. Another example of that we see, and not just in the LBL, but I see this in a lot of forests, is where they're restoring they're saying they're restoring something from, because they say, oh, this site has been altered badly. It's no longer ecologically viable. Trees that shouldn't be there are there. And take a look here. On the left is where they logged, or we're in the middle of logging a 140-year-old hardware stand to promote oak regeneration. On the right was a non-native loblolly pine plantation planted in the 50s, completely untouched. And so this really brings into question the sincerity that some land managers have. I'm not trying to say this is all land managers. I've run some land managers that really have sincere concerns, but in this case, this just really was not. Some restoration projects simply log what they say they're restoring. The DeSoto in Mississippi was historically largely a longleaf pine ecosystem, and that is a very largely disappeared ecosystem. Yes, it definitely needs to be restored. And so their restoring of longleaf in the Black Creek sale was to log out maturing longleaf, and not just log it, they logged it along a national scenic river corridor. We did take them to court. We lost, unfortunately, back in 2004 when I was in Mississippi, which is where I'm from. Now the Daniel Boone, the forest that is of immediate concern to our gracious host for this evening, Ashley Lipscomb, who works with Kentucky Hardwood. Kentucky Hardwood has valiantly worked on trying to bring reform to the Daniel Boone National Forest. Unfortunately, it is a tough go, a high volume logging zone with a lot of so-called restoration problems. And it seems like the boon is always restoring. ABR always be restoring. So they're restoring things from 100 years ago that went wrong, and then they're restoring things that they messed up 20 and 30 years ago, and they'll just mess it up again, and then in 30 or 40 years they'll see they need to restore that. So a lot of these logging projects become these self-perpetuating problems we see in the East, because a lot of these forests are on fairly short logging rotation and are just subject to a mixture of whims and fads, and once again, timber target pressures. The boon pretty much claims, as some other forests claim, that they can only restore oak woodlands by lots of logging. Although the boon has had a hard time acknowledging that people like Jim Sheff of Kentucky Hardwood has found plenty of examples of oak woodlands that have developed through natural processes with absolutely no logging, and were shaped through the classic example of trees opening up and then natural wildfire, and in some cases prescribed fire without logging. So there are plenty of examples that show that logging is not necessary to restore a lot of these sites if that is a legitimate restoration goal. There are other ways of this happening, partially allowing natural processes to happen. I did want to touch base at least a little bit. We're kind of getting closer to the end here. Federal agencies and academics tend to affect, to some degree, what happens on state lands. Now, some states have significant state lands and others don't. But states like Tennessee, Indiana, Massachusetts, a lot of their biodiversity in public lands, a lot of their public land base is actually state-owned. And we are seeing more of these regeneration and restoration rationales that are trickling down from federal agencies. Muddy Brook State Forest, here's a classic example of a forest regeneration project. Tennessee has heavy logging pressures on its 14 state forests for forest regeneration. And some of the similarities is that we see between federal and state, we see erosion on steeper slopes and shifts from a mixed character of forest composition to those dense stands of poplars and maples, or in some areas white pine, depending on whatever is that opportunistic shade tolerant species. We see that one of the worst examples of this is the Chuck Swan State Forest in Northeast Tennessee. So let's talk a little bit about some possible reforms. Let's get out of the gloom and doom a little bit here on how to start shifting away from illegitimate regeneration, restoration goals, and trying to get a little more legitimacy in the way the agency manages the land. So there has to be some untethering of fire ecology and forest restoration ecology with timber volume money targets. This will bring credibility to the idea of restoration. The agency also needs to start acknowledging failures across the board. The Cherokee acknowledging some of its failures was an encouraging precursor, for which we very much salute them. But we see these problems throughout many forests. They need to realize this is systemic. And if restoration is a sincere goal, there needs to be a halt to these large-scale projects like Brawley and the 8600 in the LBL that they just can't get a grip on, because they have no idea if what they're going to do is going to work at all. They need to show that they can do this stuff, if they're going to do this stuff, with small-scale projects. These 10,000, 20,000 acre, if we don't do this now, the forest is lost rationale, it's just got to go, and it doesn't work. A modest controlled burn program is ecologically defensible in some habitats and can accomplish some, not all, of the restoration goals that timber sales say that they can do. Smith Mountain was an area in the Cherokee. They burned it. They were going to log the mess out of it on these very steep 40, 50-degree slopes. And once again, the Cherokee, to their credit, heard the public and said, you know what, your burn program is opening up the landscape on its own. It's helping keep the spread of too many poplars and white pine. And that is an example of how a modest burn program can perform some ecological goals. But once again, fire cannot be the sole restorer. There's so many other natural processes that need to be allowed. Also, commitment to research. The Forest Service is required to have what's called monitoring and evaluation program. And once again, I'm tooting the Cherokee's horn. We asked them to partner with us to create a 300-acre research area that does not get burned, to compare how an unburned area over time compares to burns area. As an ecological control, I'm a science teacher, so I know about scientific design, and there's no other forest that does this. Every forest should be doing this. And finally, in some reform is, let's get more transparent about what's working and not working on our public lands. Censoring your own work and what you know does not invite public trust. Transparency does. And also, as once again, acknowledging time and nature are the best land managers if we will just let them. And so we come to the last of our 3 R's. We'll try to be really quick. I don't want to go too much longer. This is the new area in forest management. And this is a word called resiliency. And this is a very slippery word. And we started seeing this word cropping up 10 years ago in a lot of agency documents about climate change and carbon sequestration. And we started kind of, uh-oh. And sure enough, this has turned into a kind of a Trojan horse, or it threatens to. So the agency is saying, because of climate change, we need to do more logging to make them more resilient as climates shift. The agency actually has projections of where species will be in 100 years and where they're disappearing. And so this is reflecting in the entire new rules that will govern all national forests that came out under the Trump administration, but were already in many ways under works in the Obama administration. And these rules, once again, this is something that deserves its own presentation. And we have an entire website on this, on Tennessee Hardwood website, about the new NEPA rules. And they not only are ecologically disastrous, they very much take away your right to public participation. And so we see restoration and forest resiliency against climate change woven in throughout this new language of how forests will be managed nationwide as justifications for shutting out the public in public comment. For example, forests now can log up to 2,800 acres without meaningful public comment under what's called a CE, a categorical exclusion. And they don't have to do a separate environmental analysis. There's not a public comment that can be appealed or litigated, as long as it's considered a restoration or forest resilience project. See how those 2 R's took away some of your public rights. They can do 2 miles of road construction under these CEs, once again, under restoration resilience. And another area of forest law now that shuts you out, that has resilience listed 15, 20 times as the rationale, is the determination of NEPA adequacy. In the past, when the Forest Service did a timber sale, they had to do what's called an environmental analysis and tell you where they were going to log, what kind of logging they would do, what kind of forest types were there, why they're going to do it, do biological surveys to make sure that, you know, they're not going to kill endangered species. And if they now are going to do these big mega analyses called DNA, and so that could cover like 100,000 acres, 150,000 acres,
and have one big blanket document that doesn't list where any cutting is. And then after that is done, anything in that 100, 150,000 acre area, they can go in and say, oh, see that area over there? That fits what we need according to our determination of NEPA adequacy. And we can go ahead and stop logging it, and we don't have to tell the public at all that it happened. So this is pretty radical. And once again, the two of our R's are legal terms that try to sort of soft pedal that this language is needed. The agency needs this flexibility, because you, of course, agree with this. We need to restore these forests really fast and make them resilient against climate change. So this is a really huge shift in forest law, and just me speaking personally, one of the reasons I was attracted to national forests, not only is because that's where I like to be, but it is one of the few areas of federal government where a single normal person with no legal background can, in theory, stop a timber sale. Until now, many of the people who have done much to protect national forests since the 1980s were people, they were not scientists, they were not loggers, they were regular people. And they used the NEPA regulations that were afforded common citizens to comment on the sale, appeal the sale, and if the appeal didn't work, go to court. And we have a history of people with no credentials who managed to do that. Lamar Marshall, who worked in a chemical plant in Alabama, did it for years. Mark Donham in Illinois, he was an artist. He was able to win in court because the rules of national forest management and under national forest law afforded common citizens this type of redress. You don't see many areas of federal government that have this, and this is really important in that respect. I did want to kind of soapbox on that. So one of the ways the NEPA rules hits the East so much harder is because in the West, a lot of timber projects may not necessarily be all that intensive. They may not be clear cutting, but they're like big acres. In the East, and particularly in the South, the strategy has been to have a bunch of timber sales that sort of flew under the radar, that would be smaller in acres, but would crank a lot of volume. And we brought this up when they were drafting these new rules that set the 2,800 acre threshold. The agency used only Western forest examples of how the CEs work, because they're collaborative and they bring, they don't result in ecological problems. They never gave exemplars in the East, because in the East, our nasty stuff happened at about 2,500 acres of logging, with another 2,500 acres of logging happening right next door. In the West, you would have what would be 5 timber sales in the East wrapped up in one project. But in the East, it is different. So why was it done like this? Here, some statistics might tell you. The Forest Service has to report by the forest its cut and sold timber. And so I looked at 2020's timber. The Kisatchie in Louisiana produced 88,000 million board feet of cut timber, when it has only about 1 million acres. The Ouachita, which in Arkansas has only 604,000 acres and cranked out almost 100,000 million board feet. Compare that to a Western forest like the Lolo with 2 million acres with only 1,100 million board feet, or the Pinchot. I actually ran the disparity of cut to acreage. If we looked at as a standard, the Ouachita is being logged almost 300 times in terms of volume per acre than the Lolo in Montana is. That is where the timber volume is coming from, the Deep South. the Kisatchie, the Ouachita, the DeSoto, the Mark Twain. And because they are set to simply bundle up tens of small projects, they, under these new regulations that call for allowing this, excluding the public under forest resiliency and restoration, is allowing basically to have this high volume logging occurring in our region with almost no public oversight. And so this is where the R's of restoration and resiliency are leading us in the legal landscape. And we just talked about that, how the city allows logging for resilience and restoration, stuff like that. So this is something that's been coming for a while. And the resiliency language has been building what was originally a series of obscure documents put out by the agency on climate change and carbon sequestration. And we actually did a presentation 10 years ago at an environmental law conference warning that these documents would become precursors for a large scale document that would justify more logging on climate resiliency grounds, and it has happened. And unfortunately, it's a shame that we're seeing a cynical use of a legitimate issue of climate change, but that's what's happening. So these resiliency projects are really hitting the East hard. The most well-known one is the Foothills Project in the Chattahoochee. And this is a conditions-based management project that is one of those determination of NEPA adequacy things. It's 150,000-ish acres where up to 60,000 acres could happen, 50,000 acres of fire, up to 111 miles of trail routes under restoration resiliency language. And once again, as this programmatic EA, if it gets to come out, would basically allow the agency carte blanche to set up many projects throughout this huge area with no transparency or oversight. We're starting to see a somewhat similar use, not the exact same thing in the Boone, the Jellicoe project, using lots of restoration, resiliency kind of language as well. The North Shenandoah Mountain Project in the George Washington National Forest is had a bunch of resiliency language that sort of justified its logging. So in conclusion, the 3 R's are key ideas in forest management that, used appropriately, do have substance. We want forests to regenerate, but we know that they can regenerate naturally. There are some forest habitats that do need restoration, but we're concerned that restoration is being misapplied. And then we have this most nebulous term that's very recent, resiliency, based on very speculative ideas and what we claim is probably a cynical manipulation of legitimate concerns of climate change. We done.
Thank you, Davis, for that presentation.
Mhm.
There are quite a few messages in the
Let's get 'em.
chat box.